Great. All right. Well, it is 1:01, so I think we'll go ahead and get started. Hello and welcome everyone to the third class in the Library of Michigan's Digitization Basic Series. This is Scope and Selection for Digitization. I'm Biz Gallo, the statewide Digitization Initiatives Coordinator, and my job is to help libraries and cultural heritage organizations throughout Michigan digitize their collections and make them accessible. In order to help prepare the state to do so, we have created this 9-part series that will lay the foundation for digitizing your collections. You can see the list of other classes in the series here, which are held on the last Tuesday of each month, and we'll drop the link in the chat for registration. Now you can register for all of the courses or only of the ones that are of particular interest to you, whether to learn new skills or as a refresher. And after the series, there will be more in-depth classes offered, both on these topics as well as a variety of other topics. For example, we'll have format-specific classes, such as digitizing newspapers, scrapbooks, and audiovisual material. We'll have resource-centered classes, such as working with vendors, working with interns and volunteers, and building a community archives. And we'll have procedural classes, such as writing digitization grant applications and creating digital exhibits. If there's anything you're particularly interested in, please let me know so I can develop programming around those topics. In addition to the Digitization Basics webinar series, we'll be developing niche academy modules from the material covered in the series so you can hone your skills and earn badges in digitization. Okay, so let's go over a bit of housekeeping. This webinar is being recorded, so you can access the content again later along with the slides. The recording should be available next week, allowing time for captioning. Also, if you missed any of the previous classes, you can view the recordings by going to the Library of Michigan's webinar archive. There will be Q&A at the end, but you can also feel free to drop your questions in the chat throughout the presentation, as Becky will be monitoring the chat. Also, if you have any technical or audio issues, please reach out to Becky in the chat so that she can help resolve them. Last, there are many additional resources on the digitization page of the Library of Michigan's website. I do want to let you know that the state of Michigan has recently changed over our website, so it might look a little bit different than what you're used to. If you have trouble finding anything, please feel free to reach out. So in today's class, we're going to be looking at factors to consider when selecting items for digitization. We're also going to do a brief selection exercise. And then we'll look at scoping the right size project for your organization and prioritizing material. And then finally, we'll review some tools for selection and prioritization. As always, we're going to start off with a little poll to kind of get people involved. And I'd like to know, Becky, if you can go ahead and launch the poll, is it harder to know where to start digitizing or harder to know where to stop digitizing? Okay, it looks like pretty neck and neck with stop just eking out over start. Okay, that's good. That's good that, it's pretty even, but I get that. All right. I'm going to close out of the poll and we can jump in. So we're going to go over both of those today. We're going to start with where to start, and then we'll also talk about finding out where to stop or how to limit your digitization. So let's start by going over the factors to consider when you're selecting material to digitize. When starting a digitization project or program, it can be easy to want to digitize everything, but not everything should or even could be digitized. Resources are limited, and so in order to make the most of what we have available, we need to be thoughtful and deliberate about selection. But where to start? We start by asking 3 important questions. Should you? May you? Can you? Should you, meaning, is there a reason to digitize this material? Whether that's based on content, audience, physical condition, or other factors. May you, meaning, do you have permission to digitize this material and make it available? Can you, meaning, do you have the resources, such as equipment, time, and infrastructure, to do it right? To answer these questions, you'll need to gather stakeholders. In last month's class, we talked about what types of stakeholders to include in planning our digitization project. Like with any collaborative project, selection should not be done in a vacuum, so be sure to gather administrators, IT staff, catalogers, curators, technicians, community partners, and anyone else helping in your overall project planning. By having stakeholders included, you can help keep each other accountable and manage expectations from the beginning of a project. Once you have your stakeholders gathered, we can break down the framework of should you, may you, can you a little further in what I like to call the 5 A's. You'll need to consider audience, access, available, allowed, and able. As you go through these criteria, remember that you should be thinking of these in relation to your collections with your institution's mission and priorities in mind. What material supports your organization's resources and goals may not be the same for the library down the street. By exploring selection through this framework, we will take a process that could be very subjective and make it as objective of a process as possible. Which brings us to our first consideration, audience. Ask yourself whether there is sufficient interest in the material to justify the investment in digitizing it. Although there will always be uses that surprise us, the goal should be to provide access to material for a specified user group. This is often high research value material that is frequently requested for access. We can assume that if the material is being accessed in analog form, it is likely to be a well-utilized digital resource. But what if it's not a highly demanded resource currently? We could be anticipating future demand for digital resources of these materials. What are some examples of events that could spark an increased demand for digital resources? Do you want to take a second and drop your ideas in the chat? We're looking for examples of events that could spark demand in the future. Does anyone want to hazard a guess? Anniversary, yep. Ooh, natural disaster. I had not done that. That's usually something that's a little hard to anticipate, but I guess you could have a group of materials. Contentious election, yes. Obituaries. Yeah, great. Definitely. So you've mentioned a lot of the things that I've come up with as well. So an anniversary, whether that's for your organization or maybe your area's founding or a person or event. A history month. So March is Women's History Month, but there could be other history months coming up that your collection has resources that could support. There could be a publication or a media release. So maybe there's a book or a movie coming out that has content or themes related to the material in your collection. If you can anticipate this interest, you can get ahead of demand by planning a digitization project in advance. If the material does not currently have sufficient interest and there is not anticipated interest, do you think that digitizing material will increase the audience? And will it increase it enough to make it worth the cost and effort of digitizing? Next, we'll look at how digitization will affect access. Will digitization increase access to this material? Maybe the material is frequently requested for use and the repeated handling is causing additional wear and tear on the original. Or maybe it's not being accessed because it's difficult to handle in its current condition. Why don't you take a second and drop some examples of difficult to access content? Plat maps, yes. Large formats. Getting in the chat. Microfilm, yes. Sanborn maps, yep. Yep, exactly. Glass negatives. City directories and old documents, cassettes. Yes, perfect. These are all great examples. So some of what I've come up with is, fragile items like the glass plate negatives that were mentioned, oversized items like maps or architectural drawings, and audiovisual material that requires special playback equipment. So maybe it's not being accessed for these reasons, or maybe it's not being accessed because it's a high value item and access is restricted due to the possibility of theft or vandalism. Digitizing this material might be a great way to continue or increase access to materials that are restricted in some way while preserving and protecting the original against additional wear and tear. However, if its access is already restricted due to condition, you'll have to determine whether it's stable enough to be digitized without future damage. We should also consider whether digitization will improve access to materials. This could be through performing optical character recognition or manual transcription to improve access to content that is otherwise difficult or even impossible for some users to access in its current condition. Consider whether digital technology would enable you to see detail that is invisible to the naked eye. High-resolution scans of glass plate negatives or advanced imaging technologies of manuscripts could reveal hidden gems in your collection. Alternatively, consider whether digitizing material at your institution could improve or augment access to a thematic digital collection that already exists, but is spread across multiple institutions. By digitally combining related materials from separate institutions into a single online collection, digitization enables collaboration and provides new research capabilities that would have otherwise been impossible for a single institution to achieve on its own. Finally, is there sufficient metadata to ensure access and discovery? A collection should be arranged and described, at least at some level, to help you make decisions about content, rights, and enabled discoverability. In June's class, we'll look closer at metadata, but ideally you would already have enough information about a collection to know its scope and content, its extent or the number of items, and to track its current use. And while digitization is a great time to consider revising or augmenting existing metadata, you don't want to start from scratch in the middle of a digitization project. Metadata is also necessary to help you determine the right status of the material in your collection, whether it's under copyright and who is the intellectual property rights holder. Next, you should determine if what you're planning to digitize has already been digitized. This might be by another organization or even your own. Resources are precious, so please don't waste your time digitizing something that's already available. Where do you start? Hopefully, if it's something that has already been digitized and made available, it's also discoverable. This could be through an internet search of HathiTrust holdings or through exploring the Digital Public Library of America. You could contact a related group if you hold material from an existing organization, or even a geographically close institution that might have access to similar material. You could also check with the publisher if they have digitized versions already that might just not be available. If you're looking to digitize newspapers, have you checked to make sure that they aren't already digitized by a nearby community or the publisher themselves? The Digital Michigan Newspaper Portal from Central Michigan University has a comprehensive list of digitized newspapers in Michigan by county. This is a great place to start if you're looking to digitize newspapers in your collection. Maybe it's not the same content, the exact same content either, but perhaps there are numerous similar resources already available, and what you're looking to digitize wouldn't fill any research gaps. If you have a dozen photographs of Main Street from the same time period at the same angle with the same subjects, what will be the value add of one more photograph? Now, that also doesn't mean if it's already digitized, you shouldn't re-digitize it. Perhaps you realize that your previous specifications were not sufficient, that your material was scanned to a compressed, low-resolution file format that doesn't support long-term preservation and access. Ideally, you'll be scanning something once and using the files for many purposes, but that might not have always been the case at your organization. You can use this opportunity to identify items in your own collection that could benefit from being redigitized to higher standards. Once you've determined that you should digitize something, you can then check to see if you may digitize it. This would be either from copyright status or with permission from the copyright holder. What is copyright? Copyright is a type of intellectual property that protects original works of authorship as soon as the author fixes the work in a tangible form of expression. April's class is entirely devoted to copyright considerations for digitization projects, but I'll briefly touch on it here. Works can be published or unpublished, and that will determine their length of protection under copyright law. Once something is out of copyright, it enters the public domain, meaning that it can be used freely without copyright restriction. Ideally, anything you digitize would be in the public domain. In order to determine an item's copyright status, you would need to know whether it was published or unpublished and when it was created and or published and by who. If it is in the public domain, you may digitize and provide access to it freely. But just because something is still under copyright, that doesn't mean you can't digitize it. You may also digitize material if you have been granted permission to do so by the copyright owner. This could be through a donor agreement or licensing from the rights holder. If you have permission, make sure it is documented in writing and that the information stays with the item or items in your collections management system. You have to be careful though, because even though a donor may have signed over the rights, that doesn't necessarily mean that they had the ability to do so in the first place. Remember, physical control is not the same as intellectual control. There's another reason that having sufficient metadata will help as you select material to digitize. I will admit it can be time-consuming, expensive, and sometimes impossible to obtain permission from the rights holders. However, if the material you want to digitize is still under copyright, you should take the time to try to identify and contact the rights holder. And a lot of material in your collections is going to be unpublished, which makes determining the copyright status and holder that much more difficult. However, if you cannot identify or locate the copyright holder, you may still be able to digitize content under either the fair use or preservation exemptions under sections 107 and 108 respectively of copyright law. I won't go into detail about this now, but we will provide more context about these two exemptions in next month's class. So once you've determined that you should digitize something, and then you've confirmed that you may digitize it, you can finally look at whether or not you can digitize it. First, do you have the resources needed to digitize this material? What would those resources look like? Do you have the equipment to digitize materials in-house? Do you have funding for equipment and paying staff time or to outsource to a vendor? Do you have the expertise to digitize yourselves? These are often the most obvious resource questions that organizations are able to answer, but digitization goes beyond scanning material. You'll have to consider resources to support the whole digital lifecycle. Which leads us to our next question. Do you have the resources to provide access to the files? Do you have a platform through which to access your digital collections once they're available? Do you already have a website to host the files? Does it have search capabilities that users can identify what they're looking at? Are you able to create an environment where context and navigation are possible? Can you track if and how content is being utilized and accessed? Digitizing something is easy, but presenting it online in a way that provides enough information to make that digital object useful and discoverable requires additional resources. Last, do you have the resources to manage or digitally preserve your files? Do you have enough digital storage space? Do you have access to a server or funds for enough external hard drives to make multiple copies of the material? Do you have cloud storage for these files? Do you have staff time to manage files over time, such as running fixity checks or migrating to new formats as needed? Does your staff have the expertise or do you have access to the expertise to manage this for you? To recap, you'll need to ask yourself, is there sufficient interest in this content? Will digitization increase or improve access to this content? Is this content unavailable digitally? Do you have permission to digitize this content? And do you have the necessary resources to digitize, provide access to, and preserve this content? In an ideal world, you would be able to answer yes to all of these questions. But just because you can't answer yes to everything doesn't mean you necessarily shouldn't digitize something. It might just mean that you shouldn't digitize something right now. Maybe this exercise will highlight areas that you need to build infrastructure. Maybe it will help you prioritize material based on certain factors. As you go through the process of answering these questions, be sure to document your decisions. By documenting your decisions, You provide a reference for your digitization staff as they design a project workflow. It helps to know what is in and out of scope and understanding why material was chosen and alternatively why something was omitted. It also provides an opportunity to document any changes in selection made during the project. Maybe something was removed from scope because personally identifiable information was found, or metadata was incorrect and the item wasn't actually what you thought it was. Or maybe an item required additional conservation work in order to digitize it. You can update your documentation and revisit selection of that item at another time when you have more information. Next, it ensures that selection criteria is consistently applied across and within collections. Last, it serves as a guide for selection in future digitization projects. Understanding past and changing priorities will help you develop a framework for decision-making as your digitization program evolves and expands. All right, we're going to get interactive. We're going to take a minute and do a little activity. And I'm going to give you a scenario with some choices for digitization selection. And I'd like to hear from you which collection you would pick and why. You can feel free after I go through these to either unmute yourselves and we can make a quick discussion out of it, or you can just drop your thoughts in the chat if you're feeling more comfortable that way. All right, so your library has a local history room containing 4 collections that you're considering digitizing. The first collection, Collection A, contains 4,000 photographic negatives that were acquired when the local newspaper shut down. It is unclear how the library acquired the negatives or who has the rights. There is little corresponding metadata. The second collection, Collection B, is an oral history collection of 100 audio tapes of soldiers from World War I that were recorded in the mid-20th century. There are varying levels of documentation, including sporadic releases and transcripts. The third collection, Collection C, is 2 linear feet of family papers and photographs of a local business owner from the turn of the century. The last collection, Collection D, is a group of approximately 200 glass plate negatives of life in the area around the 1890s, shot by an anthropologist and photographer studying rural farm methods. Also in the collection are his journals, which describe the activities and interactions with locals. So between these 4 collections, I'd love to hear either your feedback. All right, we have questions. Do we have permissions clearance for C and D? Well, based on their time period, that is a good question. Based on D, nothing is under copyright from that perspective. C, based on the time period, we can just assume that it's also out of copyright. Okay. Okay. Yep, getting a lot of collection D here. Also B, yes, I appreciate the thoughts about consideration for the format. Yes, collection B would have a wider interest and may have a quickly degrading format. Yeah. Great. Yes, well, thank you so much for your feedback on this. I really appreciate that you took the time to give your thoughts. Yeah, and it seems like everybody is pretty much in agreement in terms of the main contenders, which would be, either D or B, and we'll go over the reasons why. So, yep. Collection A, it's a really large collection to manage and the rights are unclear. And although this collection would probably have a good visual appeal, it's a little too murky to dive right into, especially since it's so large. Collection B, it does require transcription of some of the other recordings, which can be labor intensive, but these are obsolete media. They're content that would have a wide range of interest, and this would be probably a good project to at least look at, especially if you can secure the right or secure permission. C, it's a small collection, so it's very manageable, but it's probably also a little research value. And then the big one that I think most people chose is collection D. So this collection size is manageable. The fragility of the glass plates makes it a good candidate in terms of preservation. And it seems like it probably has a wide range of interests, plus copyright isn't an issue. And I will say you could certainly choose differently based on your own expanded analysis of these collections and your own available resources. But just remember that when you're applying selection criteria, you should be able to be objective about these guides and not just go with your initial response. But I think you've all made really good choices, and we can just end the presentation there because you already know what to do. But we'll move on anyway, because I've already done the presentation. So, all right, next we're going to look at scoping the right size project. When planning a project, you'll need to define its scope. It can be hard to narrow down a vast range of potential collections into a specific, achievable project. I like to use this helpful formula from Amy Bacco and Marianne Swaranga at Western Michigan University. They say that you should be able to state the project scope as digitize a specific number of a known format from a given date range about subject or subjects. You'll need to determine both what is in scope and whether there is anything specifically out of scope. Perhaps you have a collection selected and overall it's a good fit. A highly used collection, but it also contains a series of newspaper clippings that are still under copyright. You can decide whether those are explicitly out of scope of the full project. You can avoid project or scope creep by clearly stating at the beginning what is in or out of scope and documenting that so you can refer back to it later. Remember, digital collection building is incremental. The goal is to build on your successes over time, learning from each project to improve processes and workflows from one to the next, not to try to do everything at once. Project scope may be further determined by constraints such as format, time, budget, and storage. While constraints are limiting by definition, you should also consider them as tools to help you refine your project. By scoping a project to fit within your available resources, you can ensure that your project is both manageable and achievable. One of the easiest constraints to identify is format. You may simply not be able to digitize something because you don't have the equipment to handle that format in-house or the resources to outsource digitizing specialized formats at that time. Oversized formats, audiovisual formats, and newspapers can all be out of scope simply due to their format. Even if you're able to digitize everything, format is still an important consideration. It will determine the equipment you'll use, the time it will take to digitize each item, the expertise required for handling. When looking at a collection with various formats, it can be a good idea to organize by format for a more streamlined project workflow. Consider doing the project in phases based on groups of materials that have similar requirements for handling and organization. If you can scope a project based on format, you can digitize more material using fewer resources and likely reduce errors by having a consistent workflow in place. Switching back and forth between adapters and settings frequently is an invitation for errors. You could also be constrained by how much you can get done in a given time. If you're using a vendor, you could be constrained by a fiscal year. If you received a grant, you could be constrained by the grant period. If you're using interns, you could be constrained by their semester. If you have volunteers, you could be constrained by the time of the year. Whatever time you have available, be realistic about how much you can get done within that timeline. Snags will always come up and you can revise your timeline if needed, but being aware of any hard deadlines or even the amount of time you have to devote to your project will help you scope the appropriately sized project. Even digitization programs or long-term projects that you plan to chip away at over time should still be bound by some timeline. In order to measure progress and success, you'll need to set up a check-in frequency. Set smaller, measurable goals for each week or month so you can reflect on progress and assess its value compared to the cost and effort to digitize. The next constraint is budget. You'll have to consider, what can you afford? I don't know about you, but I don't know many libraries or archives with infinite budgets. And even if you did have an infinite budget, I still don't recommend that you digitize everything. Not everything is worth digitizing. Not everything is worth the cost of making it available. Budgets help determine what quality equipment you can purchase, or how much you can send to get digitized in a fiscal year, or how many interns you can hire. If you're using a vendor, it's a lot easier to put a price on the cost of digitizing something. You'll know the price of each scan down to the item. But there are additional costs on your own end. Managing the project, preparing material, quality control once you receive files back, and digital storage and access systems all come with a price tag. If you're digitizing in-house, you'll have all of those costs plus the cost of equipment and staff time to digitize. If you're purchasing equipment, some scanners are significantly faster than others, so the higher price tag might be a worthwhile investment if it allows you to get more done in less overall time. Being constrained by a budget helps you plan. Even if you can't afford this now, it will help you plan for future projects. And if you have no budget, you can plan to apply for grants, take advantage of equipment loan programs, and partner with organizations that are willing to share their resources. Last but not least is storage space. How much storage space do you have? If you are limited by server space or the number of hard drives you can purchase, you can't digitize more than you can store. If you have audiovisual material, that can eat up your storage space very quickly. An hour of stereo audio content is 2 gigabytes. An hour of uncompressed standard definition video is 100 gigabytes. High definition is 500 gigabytes per hour. That can have a huge impact on the scope of your project. It might just also mean that you have to plan for increasing your storage capacity to meet the needs of your digital collections. But you can't put the cart before the horse and digitize now and get storage later. Also consider that the more you digitize, the more there is to manage. Now, not only do you have physical items in your collection, but you also have digital surrogates, which require more attention to maintain. You'll need to confirm fixity of files over time by validating checksums, which takes staff time and processing power. Consider all of your resources and constrain your project scope to within how far they will stretch. Even if you have endless resources, you will still have to prioritize what material gets digitized first. Decide on materials eligible to be digitized using the 5 A's, and then prioritize items based on available resources. There are several considerations that can affect this, some of which are internal and some are external. First, you may have a legal requirement to provide access to certain content based on your type of organization. It may be easier to incorporate digitizing this content into your routine to provide ready access if these are frequently requested items. Just keep in mind that if you are digitizing as a replacement for the original and not just as an access copy, there will likely be additional requirements and parameters for the types of files and how they're handled. Next, there are also ethical considerations. On the one hand, there may be an opportunity to digitize material from or underrepresented groups. Historically, records from or about these groups were collected less frequently, making it that much harder to find related digital resources. Harvard's Houghton Library sought to address this issue last year by pausing all of their ongoing digital projects to redirect and focus solely on building digital collections related to Black American history. They saw a gap in their digital collections and made a dedicated effort to make this content available digitally. On the other hand, you may have some culturally sensitive material in your collection that you may legally be able to digitize, but perhaps not ethically, such as indigenous material that may have been sacred or private to a specific group. If you are planning to digitize this material, I encourage you to partner with groups that represented to ensure that they are part of the decision-making process for how these materials will be handled. Err on the side of engaging the communities that have created these objects and be prepared to accept no as an answer. This is another part of including stakeholders from within and outside of your organization. Another consideration may be determined by the condition of the material in your collection. Consider future access to media that needs to be digitized for preservation. All magnetic audiovisual media will need to be digitized in order to be preserved due to obsolescence. In addition to not being able to access it currently, benign neglect will be the enemy when it comes to this media. Not only does it need to be preserved, there is a ticking clock on how long we have left to digitize as equipment and expertise in the field become more and more rare. Last, your priorities may be influenced or even dictated by your funding. Grant opportunities usually focus on specific topics or content. Donors often have a desire to see their material or their interests put at the front of the queue. Hopefully, the funding priorities align with your institution's own priorities or mission. Once you have selected material for digitization and scoped the appropriate size project, you'll need to go one step further. From that now filtered pool of material, you should scope an appropriate pilot project, which will depend on your overall project size. Whatever your project size, it's best to start with a single item and follow it through the entire process, from digitization to quality control to hosting, to ensure that your workflows are working for you. Once you have that part done, you can move forward with the rest of the pilot. The size of your pilot will depend on the size of your overall project. And there's no strict rule, but 10 to 20 items is appropriate for many medium-sized projects. If you're planning a large project of hundreds or thousands of items, you can incrementally increase your pilots to make sure that processes and workflows scale with you. Start with 10, then 100, and so on as needed. When you're selecting items, make sure it's a representative sample of the full project and try to avoid cherry picking the simplest or most straightforward objects. You may have to do additional pilots based on each format if you're digitizing large swaths of different formats. And while I did say don't cherry pick for a quick and painless pilot, you may want to use the pilot as an opportunity to front run priority or popular items to get buy-in and see an early return on your investment. Okay. Last, we're going to look at some tools and resources to help you with selection. If you're looking for tools to help you navigate scope and selection for digitization, there are a handful of ones that can make it easier to be objective about the process. The first is CLEAR's Selection for Digitizing a Decision-Making Matrix. This document distills the information contained in Selecting Research Collections for Digitization, which frames the decision-making process for selection of materials for digitization as a series of questions into an easy-to-use decision tree. The matrix asks you yes or no questions about the nature of the collections and their use, as well as the realities of organizational and technological infrastructure of the institution making the decision. If you're looking for an objective tool, this is a great place to start as it will lead you through each question and you'll be prompted either to stop or to proceed with planning, implementing, and evaluating the digitization project. Next, if you're looking for a tool to help you prioritize media for digitization, you can explore the Museum of Obsolete Media site, which has two different tools for evaluating the stability and obsolescence of various media types. First, the media stability rating can help determine how long different media will last before the content is likely to become degraded or unreadable. Ratings range from stable, meaning that examples with this rating are likely to be usable for the foreseeable future, to very high risk, meaning that they are likely to be degraded and in urgent need of migration. The other rating is the media obsolescence ratings, which rates media on how easy it is to find equipment to access information from the various formats. These ratings range from in current use or low risk, meaning that equipment is still either being produced or is widely available through backwards compatible alternatives, to extinct, meaning that equipment for this media is very rare, specialized, and/or expensive and difficult to maintain. Again, excuse me, these are tools to help you prioritize media to digitize, but you should still be able to answer all of the 5 A's and determine that this is worth digitizing before even looking at its priority for digitization. However, once you have media in your collection that you have selected as being a good candidate for digitization, it is worth assessing both the media's stability and obsolescence ratings, as something may be stable but obsolete. Alternatively, something may have equipment widely available, but the format itself may be heavily degraded. You can use both tools to prioritize materials for the limited resources at your disposal. The last tool we're going to discuss is Penn State's Selecting Levels of Digital Preservation Commitment Survey. This Qualtrics-based survey, developed by Nathan Tallman and Lauren Work, provides a points-based score for each of the criterion for digital collections and aids in digital preservation prioritization. Criteria includes research value, legal and fiduciary obligations, uniqueness, replacement costs and investment, preservability, representation and agency, provenance and authenticity, and restrictions. The overall score provides a suggested digital preservation level based on objective rankings. This survey also encourages discussion and collaboration between stakeholders in decision-making about digital preservation, as various roles bring with them knowledge and expertise that aid in this prioritization. I do want to note that the survey is an example, as the survey results are specific to Penn State and their internal levels of preservation commitment. But the guiding questions and point allocations can help guide your own decision-making using an objective framework. I will also note that the Library of Michigan is collaborating with the Michigan Digital Preservation Network to translate this survey into a tool that can be used in a broader environment for digitization selection and digital preservation priority here in Michigan. Whatever tool you use to weigh the cost and benefit of a given digitization project, remember that the results will likely be different for every institution. Each has its own mission and its own population that it serves. Remember that these choices should be reflective of your institution. It is your job as the selector to apply your own interpretation based on your individual organization's goals and priorities to this general set of selection criteria and principles. Thoughtful selection helps ensure that your resources are being invested in the most significant and useful collections. The initial cost of digitization and continued investment in digital preservation make it all the more important to be thoughtful about what you'll select to digitize. All right, so that is it for today. Just remember, should you, may you, can you, ask the 5 A's, document your decisions, right size the project, and use tools to help you with objective selection. All right, now it's time for the questions that you have for me. So you can feel free to either drop them in the chat or you can turn on your mic and we can have a conversation. Okay. Well, if nobody has any questions, that's all right. We'll move on. Oh, I covered everything. Thank you. Okay, so please join me for next month's webinar. We'll be looking at copyright considerations for digitization on Tuesday, April 26th. And I will be joined by Clara Mambila, the law consultant from the Library of Michigan. And we'll also drop the link in the chat to register for this class. I also want to say thank you to the Institute of Museum and Library Services for making this project possible. And that I would also like to call attention to the fact that the Library of Michigan's Improving Access to Information grant is now open, and the deadline for that closes May 31st. So if you're interested in applying for a digitization grant, you can visit michigan.gov/LSTA, or you can contact me and I'm happy to talk with you about that. And as always, feel free to contact me if you have questions, whether about this or any topic at all regarding digitization, digital preservation, and access. I'm happy to help you and plan your project. So thank you so much. And I look forward to seeing you all next month as we talk about copyright.